Today, the life scenario you are going to experience is the life of a ruler's son. You were born in a deep estate and large courtyard. Not the kind that is open for visits with people coming and going, but the kind with guards at the high points and black special cars parked outside the gate. The way your father controlled a territory was as strict and quiet as some people managing a warehouse. No one dared ask questions. Your mother wore silk clothes and often rested quietly. Her redecorating the halls every few months was her way of venting her emotions. You had 14 servants, a private garden, and playthings specially delivered from very far away. When you walked into the schoolhouse, every child would smile at you. Before you even finished telling your joke, they laughed first. At 7 years old, you thought that was friendship. Actually, it wasn't. That was just what awe and fear looked like written on children's faces. You only understood the difference a long time later, and by then, it didn't matter anymore. For your birthday feast, there were 200 guests, but not a single one came voluntarily. The guests stood against the wall holding gifts, all with the exact same expression: respectful, cautious, and ready to leave at any moment. When you opened a gift, everyone applauded. It sounded rehearsed because it indeed was. You once made a friend, the son of an advisor. You two built small pillars in the courtyard and laughed until your ribs hurt. He taught you a card game invented by his elders, and you played it for 3 consecutive hours. The next week, his entire family was transferred to a very far and very cold place. Your security detail had flagged them. At just 9 years old, simply because you shared pastries with a child you shouldn't get close to, you caused people to be sent far away. From then on, you stopped trying to make friends. You still remember that card game, but you never played it again. Your father was like a set of symptoms that appeared once a month, surrounded by solemn-faced people who obeyed his every word. When he looked at you, it wasn't an elder looking at a junior, it was an audit. Stand a bit straighter, speak a bit louder. No crying aloud. Crying is weakness, and he intended to correct it out of you. You saw him on video screens more than in person. On the screens he would smile, but at home he didn't smile. Most nights he dined alone in his study. You sometimes stood outside the door listening to the clattering sounds of utensils. You wanted to knock but never did. Once you put a drawing under the door, it drew the two of you. He never mentioned it. A week later you found it in the waste paper room, folded in half. He saw it, he just didn't care. When you were 14, everything changed. He made you stop your studies and sent you in a special car to a villa in the suburbs. You thought it was a birthday surprise, maybe a car or a feast. He led you down the stone steps into a cool, quiet room. A person was left there with only a single light above his head, just because he said something inappropriate. Your father handed you a short baton, 4 words: teach him some boundaries. That person wore glasses and had very soft hands. He looked like a schoolteacher. Everything inside you was saying no. You looked at your father's expression, those eyes auditing your deficiencies. Do you know what would happen if you refused? You would become that deficiency. You swung down. The first strike was very light. The second strike was heavier. By the 5th strike, something in your brain went completely silent. Your father gave a slight nod. To him, that was the highest approval, and he walked out. You stood there holding the baton, your knuckles turning white. You had just bought his approval. The price was someone else's broken dignity, and there was no turning back. That nod became the thing you chased. For the next 4 years, you went from reluctant to reliable. He put you in charge of disciplining the younger generation youths wearing uniform clothing. You organized rallies. The square was packed with young people chanting his name, either out of genuine conviction, or because others were watching, or because the consequence of not doing so was a record with their names on it. You established networks everywhere, where children relayed inappropriate words spoken at home. A 16-year-old youth by your side relayed his elders' improper remarks. The elders vanished for 3 weeks and came back thinner and quieter, while the youth received favored treatment approved by your signature. You didn't think about these things, you only wanted the next nod. At 18, he handed the external voice over to you. You hired people who understood the internet, you guided public trends, created unflattering images of opponents, and let the rules diffuse. You built his power into a brand. It was very effective, the attention was very high, and even more people vanished. You hadn't linked these 2 numbers together, not yet. You also formed a content team, young, educated, and compliant. They produced records about your father's infrastructure, highlights of various engineering projects, and high-altitude drone shots backed by soft music. 80% of the comment section consisted of machine accounts. The remaining 20% were people who knew what the outcome would be if they didn't post positive comments. Like a host, you tracked data reach, exposure, emotional tendencies. You never tracked the other set of numbers, the numbers handled by your security detail, after those emotional tendencies dropped. At 22, you became the youngest chief official. At 25, you actually controlled the grand situation. Your father's body was weakening, but his suspicion never waned. The people around him were like those waiting for a vacant seat. Yet no one dared move because they knew you controlled the surveillance network, information channels, and the youth groups. You used lenses, algorithms, and predictive tools to replace his old methods. People with differing voices were no longer directly taken away. They were flagged, their livelihoods restricted, families affected, residences visited, jobs questioned. And children's school environments changed. There was no conflict, no chaos, just a slow and quiet pruning that left no trace and never became the focus. You told yourself this was more gentle. Those who vanished from the public sight might disagree, but they no longer had the standing to speak. Your father should have been grateful to you for modernizing his system, making it more efficient and longer lasting. Instead, he began to look at you with the eyes he used for everyone else, that measuring glare. You realized a ruler is never satisfied by competence. Competence itself is a threat. One night, the chief of security handed you a document. Your father had signed an order to reassign you to a vacant post, a place where nothing would happen, which translated to exile. Not because you failed, but because you were too excellent. You became someone he could not tolerate, someone who didn't need him. You sat in the dark for a long time, you calculated the situation. You controlled the system, he only controlled the old men who still relied on old ways. The situation was very clear. Using the contact methods you hid many years ago, you arranged the pieces. It was he who taught you to be cautious, and you learned it better than he anticipated. You proposed a transition plan to the officials around him. Positions would not change, benefits would be better. You knew their difficulties, personal affairs, and health conditions. You knew whose child was studying abroad and whose savings were hidden in a place no one knew. You didn't threaten, you didn't need to, you simply let them know that you knew everything. Most people turned to your side within a few hours, and the rest were persuaded by those who had already turned. At midnight, the command power obeyed you. Your father was resting upstairs. He didn't know that while he slept peacefully, the grand situation had already changed hands. The replacement took only 11 minutes. There was no clamor, no unusual movement on the streets, just one information blackout, a compound lockdown, and 40 guards obeying only you. At 3 a.m., you walked into his room. He was wearing a long robe, sitting on the bed, no formal uniform, no medals, no entourage. Just a tired old man with thin arms and signs of age on his hands. The heaviest person in this territory looked just like some elder waiting for a medical checkup. He looked at you, not surprised. He had known long ago he raised you to be like this, he just hadn't intended to make himself the demonstration. You told him he was to be transferred to a suburban manor, with food, doctors, and a courtyard, but no external contact, no visitors. And no decision-making power. He stared at you for a long time. And then he smiled, not a smirk, but a genuine smile. The kind of smile you spent your entire upbringing trying to earn. He finally said, "You are ready." You were at a loss. You had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but not a single version had him smiling. You nodded to the guards, they carried him out. He did not resist, he did not look back. You sat on his bed, it was still warm. You didn't know if you had just stabilized a world. Or if you had simply passed his final test. Both feelings felt real. And both feelings felt unpleasant. The compound was very quiet. For the first time in your life, there was no one telling you what to do, and the silence was clearer than you expected. The outside world was praising you. People who used to avoid you lined up to take photos with you. You announced adjustments. Opening up speech, regular selections, releasing detainees. The reports were a sheet of praise, front page spreads, cover stories, accolades, nominations. You were 28 and the world called you hope. It lasted for about a month. Once speech was opened, the truth began to appear. Past traumas, encroached fortunes, records of tyranny, all bearing your family name. Images you had never seen, statements from people you had never met, describing things that happened in rooms you had never entered. It didn't matter, your name was in the prominent place. The people you released wanted justice. Some people gathered near your quarters, but those quarters were built for optics, not for human beings. You called an emergency consultation, proposing adjustment plans, assistance programs, and a gradual transition. An official from the old era leaned over and said, "Sir, the ideals are very good. But these people need to survive right now. You know what can take effect immediately." You told yourself you were different. You said this every morning, like a watchman checking a lock he clearly knows is broken. 6 months later, temporary measures became long-term ones. Speech was guided. The grand situation was stabilized. Differing voices were noted. Order was secure. Gatherings were dispersed. Smooth selections were postponed, and the situation was tense. With every single directive you issued each day, you attached a reason, and with every reason you discovered something even more terrifying. You were lying to yourself and you believed every single sentence. At night you drafted speeches about moving forward and patience. In the morning you read reports about the number of disciplined people and gathering situations. You used the same cup of tea to read 2 documents. And the distance between the 2 documents could no longer be felt by you. This was the moment you knew the transition was complete. One evening you checked the footage of the suburban manor. Your father was sitting in the courtyard tending to flowers and plants. The sun was setting behind him and he looked peaceful, relaxed, secure, and at ease. He was reading a book, a blanket covering his knees, a cup of hot tea on the table. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden and decided never to pick it up again. You looked at your own room. Ballistic glass, multiple screens, emergency buttons, and a communicator that rang every few minutes. Outside every single door, there were guards on duty. You hadn't left this building for 11 days. You didn't remember the last time you read unrelated text. You didn't remember the last time you sat outdoors without checking the surroundings first. You built a courtyard for your father, and that was the most secure corner in this territory. You inherited his compound, and that was the only prison. Somewhere in the courtyard, with a steady hand, he trimmed the flowers and plants. He knew what you were just beginning to understand: the ruler's position was never a reward. It is a shackle, and you walked in voluntarily. The ruler's greatest trick was not holding onto the situation for 40 years, but raising the only person who could replace him, and ensuring that person was destined to repeat his path.